Good morning, everybody. I am genuinely really thrilled to be here today, as evidenced by the fact that I tried to jump the queue and speak before Angela. But I'm very glad I didn't, because as a chiropractor by background, it was lovely to hear all about bones again. So thank you, Angela, and I'm sorry I tried to jump ahead of you, but we're here now, and we're here to talk about pain. I'm going to start, if I may, with a case study. And I'd like you to imagine that this is somebody who's come to see you in your professional capacity. If you have pen and paper, now would be the time to get them out, because I'm going to ask you to write some things down. So here's your patient. He's a 23-year-old farmer, and he's local. He's lived in the Lake District his whole life. With his farming, he's had a lot of injuries with his work previously. So this includes injuries to both of his knees, superficial injuries to his legs, but also sciatic pain because of a lower back injury that he's had with his farming work. 4 years ago, so just at the age of 19, he had an arthroscopy on his knee and had part of the cartilage removed in his right knee. And then 1 year ago, at the tender age of 22, he had a double discectomy at L4-5 and L5-S1. He is still running his farm. It's cattle, sheep, hens, geese, and he does it entirely by himself. So, my question to you, and this is where I need you to write something down, what advice would you give to this gentleman? So he's already young and has had a lot of injuries. This might include advice about things you want him to stop doing, things you want him to start doing, other healthcare professionals you might want him to see. Just make a little note of that now, write it down with your pen and paper. The other question I want to ask you is, what might we expect in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line? So again, he's young, isn't he? And he's already had all these injuries and, you know, for his age, quite a bit of surgery as well. What does his trajectory look like? Perhaps particularly you'd want to think about his function. So what kind of things will he be able to do in 30 years as he's approaching 60? And what about his pain levels? So having injuries like this, of this nature, and surgeries at this young age, what does that say about his risk of chronicity and his risk of persistent pain in the future? Now, usually I would go around and ask individual people, but because we're quite a big group today, I was hoping maybe we could just do by show of hands. So if you look at your answer to the first question, what advice would you give? How many of you wrote down take up long distance running? Nobody. Interesting. This is the true story of Joss Naylor, local legend and hero of the fell running community, who sadly died just last year. So this was him at 23 with all his farming injuries and all his surgeries. He still holds the record for the National Three Peaks Challenge, which he did in under 12 hours, remarkably enough. He did the Welsh 3000s, which is the 14 peaks of Snowdonia, in 5 hours. And then at age 60, so here we are, healthy aging, at age 60, he ran 60 Lakeland tops in 36 hours. And then, 10 years on, at the age of 70, you might expect him to slow down a bit, but he didn't. He ran 70 Lakeland tops in 21 hours. I think he might be a friend of yours, Angela's, actually. Really what I am trying to demonstrate with this local legend is that tissue damage and previous injury and previous surgeries may not be as predictive as we think of risk of chronicity and loss of function and pain in the future. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. But before I do, who am I? My name's Julia Gover. As I mentioned already, I'm a chiropractor by background, but I've worked all my career with people with persistent musculoskeletal pain, which is the subject of my master's, which I'm due to complete this year. And I work with Flippin Pain as a community pain champion. I'm joined by my colleague Judge, who's going to be running the workshops this afternoon, who is a physio, a pain science educator and researcher at Teesside University. Now, the lady who did these slides is called Sam. She's also with us, and true to form, she's not actually put herself on the slides, but she basically runs the show, so she should be up here, really. Now, I have a theory that I would like to share with you. I think if we all left this building now and went out onto the streets of Kendal and we asked the average man on the street, what is pain? Why do we get it? What's it for? What's the point of it? I reckon after a little bit of thought, the average man on the street would come up with these 3 statements or something very like them. He would say, pain occurs as a result of injury. Makes sense? The worse the injury, the worse the pain. In other words, the pain is proportional to the injury. So if you have more tissue damage or a greater extent of injury, then the pain should increase. And therefore, if the pain is ongoing or becomes persistent, then that must mean that the injury hasn't healed, or perhaps there's something sinister going on beneath the surface that we don't know about. Now, I would say, on the face of it, these seem like 3 quite reasonable statements to us, don't they? This is actually our everyday experience of pain most of the time. But you don't have to poke too hard at these statements before they start unraveling just a little bit. So how about some of these examples? This is quite a famous one. This was published in the BMJ a few years ago now. But this is the story of a builder who was working on site. He jumped from one scaffolding platform to another and landed on an upturned nail, which went right through his boot, bottom to top. He was obviously in quite a lot of pain, was rushed to A&E and given fentanyl, which didn't touch the pain at all. And they then removed the boot and discovered something quite remarkable. It had actually passed right between his toes, and there wasn't a scratch on him. But he was experiencing very severe and very real pain, with no injury or tissue damage. Here's a more everyday occurrence. I don't know how many of you may have experienced this. It happens to me all the time. You get to the end of the day and you discover a bruise or a cut or a scratch, and you think, no idea how I did that. Can't think how that would have even happened. You had tissue damage with no pain at the time of injury. What about the common headache? So if you think about the dozens or possibly even hundreds of headaches you've had in your lifetime, how many times have you said to yourself, oh, I must have had some kind of head trauma. That's why I have this headache. We're actually very comfortable blaming headaches on a whole range of other things, aren't we? Stress, too much screen time, not enough water, too much alcohol, something like that. Does anybody know who this is? Just yell if you know. Who is it? Don't just say yes, tell me who it is. That's right, yes. So this, I mean, in this picture, it's the actor James Franco, but he's portraying Aaron Ralston. So Aaron Ralston is the famous mountaineer and boulderer who was out bouldering one day and some rocks shifted and he got his arm trapped between a boulder and the wall of the canyon that he was traversing. He was there for 5 days. Now, if you're squeamish, this is the point where you put your fingers in your ears, okay? The way he escaped was that he self-amputated his arm. And the reason that he is up on this board, you can take your fingers out of your ears now. The reason he's up on this board with all the others is that in his book and in subsequent interviews, he describes that experience as completely painless, but not without other sensations. So it wasn't just a case that, the arm was dead and he couldn't feel anything. It was that actually he could feel everything that was going on, but it did not create an experience of pain. So super interesting stuff. Here's one you might be a bit more familiar with, phantom limb pain. So this can happen in amputees, but also it can happen in people who are born without limbs. And this is where there's an experience of pain in that limb that is no longer there, or that limb that was never there. So this is not just pain without tissue damage. This is pain without tissue, actually, isn't it? One step even further. And again, this is a mixture of perhaps more extreme examples, but also lots of everyday examples. So maybe pain is not quite as straightforward as proportional to tissue damage or proportional to injury. We know this from research as well. So this is a table from a study where they took 163, I think, people who did not have any low back pain, and they put them through an MRI scanner. Now, the numbers at the top which you can't really see, I'm afraid, but it goes from 20 to 80. That's age by decade. And then we've got some MRI findings listed on the right-hand side there. And these are, remember, all people without low back pain who were put in this scanner. And yet if we look at the highlighted column, which is age 50, 80% of them had disc degeneration. And what else? Yeah, over half had loss of disc height, a disc bulge. Over a third of them had a disc protrusion, and nearly a third of them had facet degeneration, which is arthritis in the joints at the back of the spine. Now remember, these are findings that are not causing pain. And people generally have two responses to this slide. Some people say, oh, that's interesting, like pain and injury aren't linked. Some people look at their age bracket and think, oh, there's like a 52% chance I've got a disc injury. Maybe I should just stop doing everything and be extra careful. Please don't do that. So the analogy that I would like to draw here is that changes in the spine that we typically see on an MRI to do with aging or use or activity might be likened to wrinkles on the face. So, you know, as we get older, a lot of us do get these wrinkles around the eyes, around the lips. We don't typically get face pain with them. And it's essentially the same in the spine. So I used to tell my patients all the time that these are not really kind of MRI findings, they're kind of evidence that you've used your spine, because the only place a textbook spine exists is actually in a textbook. And this is the slide you need to remember from today. If you remember nothing else about my presentation, this is what I want you to walk away with. Hurt does not always mean harm. So pain and injury are actually two completely separate phenomena. They often occur together, we know they do, but you can have an injury with no pain, and you can have pain with no injury. They can occur completely separately and independently of each other. This is one of our Flippin Pain key messages, that hurt does not always mean harm. It's the one that I'm going to be talking to you about in this presentation, but we have others, and we're running a workshop later if you want to ask us any questions about those. But just to take you through the key messages now. So we say persistent pain is common and can affect anyone. Hurt does not always mean harm. Everything matters when it comes to pain. That's a very important one to remember. Medicines and surgeries are often not the answer. Understanding your pain can be key, and recovery is possible. And again, we're focusing on hurt does not mean harm today, but there'll be opportunities to ask questions at the workshop. So if pain is not about injury, and it's not about tissue damage, what is it about? Well, I would like to suggest to you today that pain is really about protection and is really about threat. And again, I'm very glad I'm going after you, Angela, because your talk on the survival mechanism was fantastic. But I would like to suggest that pain operates a little bit like some of the alarm systems in your car. So let's imagine you and I are going for a drive and you are forced to swerve. Perhaps you're avoiding a cat or somebody crossing the road without looking. And we hit a lamppost. We hit it sufficiently hard that there's a dent in your front bumper and it damages your engine. Now, lots of things would happen at that point, but one of the things that would happen is that the check engine light on your dashboard would come up. So in my car, it's a big yellow spanner. And this is a warning of damage that has already happened. Now, we know that pain can do that and does work like that. It's very common when you get an injury to have an experience of pain, to draw your attention to that injury for protection. But we also know that pain can work like the reverse parking sensors in your car. So if your car has these, when you are reversing, you'll notice that the beeping of the reverse parking sensors becomes louder and more frequent and more obnoxious as you get closer to the obstacle. So you get something like beep, 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 beep. And we know that pain can work like this as well. So it's actually very common to get an experience of pain that occurs in anticipation of or in advance of an injury. So you might be familiar with this in situations such as you're working out at the gym and you're starting to feel a bit sore, and that is warning you, don't push any further or we're going to have an injury. Now, evolutionarily, this is a huge advantage for us as individuals and as a species. It confers a massive survival advantage for us. So if we have a system that doesn't just tell us when an injury has already happened but can actually prevent it happening in the first place, that is really, really beneficial for us. However, I'd like you to imagine now that instead of your parking alarm going off within a few feet of an obstacle, imagine that it goes off if there's anything in a 1 mile radius. So the first thing that would happen is you would really lose the ability to distinguish between what is an imminent threat and what is really too far away to be worrying about at the moment. The second thing that would happen, like all alarms that go off too often, it would run the risk of just being ignored. And this is something that we hear at the campaign from people who live with pain, that often when they first get some sort of persistent pain diagnosis, they try and ignore the pain and push past it and often end up creating more problems than they solve. The third thing that would happen if your alarm was oversensitized like this is that it would really hamper your enjoyment of driving this car. You might just be the type of person who likes to hop in the car and have a little drive around, but the constant beeping is really going to take that away, isn't it? It's going to ruin your experience of it. So you may find that to avoid it, you think, well, I won't just hop in the car and have a drive around. Maybe I actually will avoid going out to social activities. Maybe I'll try and commute to work a little bit less often. And so it would actually start having an impact on other areas of your life. So whilst this oversensitized alarm system is doing a really, really good job of keeping your car safe, nothing gets within a mile of this car without your car knowing about it. It is actually stopping you from doing other things that are really meaningful to you. And we know that pain can operate like this. Persistent pain, we hear from people who live with it, can really take meaningful activities out of their lives and leave them feeling quite isolated. You may be familiar with this report, the Bridging the Gap report, which was published last year. There's lots of things in this report that are really, really important, but the one that really stuck out to me was that if you ask professionals what are common barriers that your patients experience in terms of getting more physically active, they will generally say motivation, people don't want to change, and cost. Gyms and leisure centres are terribly expensive. If you ask people who live with pain or other chronic long-term conditions, what are your barriers that you experience to becoming more physically active, they tend to say pain and fatigue or low energy. So in the report, this was dubbed the empathy gap between what clinicians perceive to be barriers and what consumers perceive to be barriers, which I think is fair. Perhaps some of it is about empathy, but I think a lot of it as well is clinicians don't like seeing people in pain either, actually. And so we hear, again, anecdotally and from experience as healthcare professionals ourselves, we hear that people are told all the time, oh, well, if it hurts, just don't do it. And so, clinicians, I think, it's not just an empathy thing, but I think they don't like seeing people in pain. But if we understood that pain and tissue damage were actually two separate phenomena, how might this change how we talk to patients about their activity levels? This is a question, I don't know if any of you use the BQ or the MSKHQ questionnaires in your practices, but this is one of the questions from there where patients are asked to agree or disagree. It's not safe for someone with a condition like mine to be physically active. And the extent to which they agree is actually highly predictive of their risk of chronicity. And yet, we know that the research shows us not only is physical activity very, very safe for these people, but it can be hugely beneficial for all kinds of chronic conditions, but perhaps particularly persistent pain. However, people may be reluctant to start these exercise treatments due to fear of pain and further injury. But again, if we understood as clinicians and if our patients understood that hurt does not mean harm, how might this change how we talk to them about it? So, this is the final thing I'm going to talk you through, and then I think it's coffee after this, isn't it? So, the pain cycle. So, this is a concept that we use in pain science education quite a lot to talk to people about how to manage their pain. So, if the top right there is the person experiencing pain, and this pain might lead them to fear of injury and therefore fear of more pain. And because of that, they come to fear movement itself, and so they move less. So this is a phenomenon known as kinesiophobia. That lack of movement leads to deconditioning, loss of fitness, disuse. But also, because of a lack of engagement in meaningful activities, there can be frustration, isolation, low mood. Now we know, I mentioned before, hadn't I, that everything matters when it comes to pain. That was our third key message in the campaign. We know that all of these things, so fear of movement, fear of injury, beliefs about pain, low mood, feeling isolated, all of these things will actually increase the experience of pain. So it will hurt more because of these psychological and social factors. But with increased pain comes an increased fear of more pain and an increased fear of more movement, and therefore even less movement, and therefore even more loss of fitness. And so this pain cycle actually becomes a downward spiral. The exciting thing is, for all of you guys here today as movement therapists or movement adjacent therapists, physical activity is a really fantastic point to come into this cycle and start to turn it the other way. Because if we can tell people, actually, it is safe for you to do this particular set of activities, or we can encourage them to get back to an activity that is meaningful for them, and encourage them that a little bit of discomfort might not be the end of the world, we can start to reverse this pain cycle. So you will not get that loss of fitness, that deconditioning. People will not feel socially isolated, frustrated. It will improve their mood. We know that physical activity has a big impact on mental health, and therefore it will hurt less. So their experience of pain will actually decrease. And then because of that, they might not feel so frightened about moving. They won't fear injury, they won't feel pain. And so we can start to turn this spiral upwards. And the excellent news is I was looking through the list of attendees for this event last week when I was preparing to come. And every single person that I looked at, I thought, oh, they're in a really good position to have a really positive impact on pain. So this is something that all of you can take home and start doing. Thank you so much for listening. Please do join us at the workshop. I'll be taking questions there.